Hello, welcome to the Unassuming Podcast. I'm your host, Karen Phelan, and this episode we're going to devote to challenging our assumptions and examining our beliefs on money. More specifically, is money evil or is it a necessary evil? And I'm joined with two of my absolute favorite people in the world, Peter Neuwirth and Gerald Harris, because these guys are whip smart and they're curious about the world and they're also unassuming. So, my friend Pete has been a consulting actuary for over 40 years, and through his firm, Neuwirth Associates, he develops customized retirement income strategies for high net worth individuals and families. A graduate of Harvard College with a degree in mathematics and linguistics, Pete is a fellow of both the Society of Actuaries and the Conference of Consulting Actuaries. And he's the author of two books, What's Your Future Worth? And Money Mountaineering, which offers 6 guiding principles for navigating the complex and uncertain world of money. And my friend Gerald Harris brings deep expertise in economic and financial analysis, honed through years of modeling work in corporate finance, strategic planning, and scenario analysis. He holds a BA in economics from Morehouse College and an MBA in finance and business economics from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And he's the author of The Art of Quantum Planning and the founder of the Quantum Planning Group. So, welcome, guys. I just wanted to start off to let you know why I chose this topic, because I'm seeing the kind of confluence of two contradictory things. First, we seem to be in an age of absolutely rapacious greed. It seems like billionaires can't get enough money. It seems like everything is a scam, and all of our algorithms are designed to extract and exploit as much money from people as possible. On the other hand, it's become really obvious to everyone that money, really isn't a thing. It used to be the gold standard, but now it's not gold. It's not even paper. It's just numbers on an account on a screen. So the contradiction is we have people who are going absolutely nuts on their worst behavior for this thing, money, and yet money isn't anything. So, Gerald, you
hmm
had you had some comments about money.
Yeah, I had some thoughts about the pursuit and use of money. I go back to the point that I can demonstrate to you that money in and of itself is not evil, because if I had like $1 million on the table, all cut into $100 bills in a stack, and it just sat on the table by itself, it wouldn't do anything, right? So it would
Right.
just sit there, right? So the money in and of itself is an object, right? And what I think it is the pursuit of it, which is all my biblical friends may know that phrase there, pursuit and use of the money, and what people do in the pursuit of it and the use of it, because it's not the money that's evil, it's the use of the money by people that can be evil for all manner of reason. One thing I learned in some of my reading that I've been puzzling ever since I read it is that when capitalism emerged, and particularly the form of capitalism in the United States, the Catholic Church came out against it. The Catholic Church was against what was called Americanism, right? And I think the core of that was this issue around the use and pursuit of money, because I believe the church at that time thought that the things people would do with that were evil or immoral. And if the pursuit of money overran other values, such as justice and kindness and mercy and generosity, then it had to be evil, right? As we know, the Catholic Church lost that argument and seemingly have plenty of money themselves, as we noticed with some of the Vatican banking scandals a couple of years ago, where a guy was caught with $30 million in a suitcase at an airport, and he had happened to be head of the Vatican Bank, right? So let me just say there that I think it is the pursuit and use of the stuff that really opens us up to this question of evil.
Gerald, I think you're absolutely right. There is really no inherent evil in money, and it's what people do, and to get it and to use it, that's where the evil starts. But they also use it for good, and sometimes the pursuit is helpful and increases the productivity of our economy and does all kinds of other things. But I'd like to focus on what really is money, because that's where I think we really got off that's the slippery slope. I mean, money historically is a brilliant invention. It's a brilliant human invention. It's the way barbers can cut people's hair and still feed their family. It's a medium of exchange, and this goes back thousands of years. And but just like any other really good idea that people come up with, that was not good enough. And then people started getting more and more clever. And the very first clever enhancement to money was interest. Gerald, you mentioned that the Catholic Church was against capitalism, but way before that, all of the major religions came out against the concept of interest. Notion that people would give farmers seeds, and then people would grow crops, and then you would give back seeds plus some of the crop. And that became the first concept of interest. Well, back then, if you didn't pay your interest, the penalties were a little harsher. People got put into slavery if you didn't pay your interest. So that went on for a while. And then there was this notion of gold became the medium of exchange. It was divisible. And people would give each other gold, and it would be used as money. And then the concept came, maybe gold should earn interest. And we can go on and on about how that happened. And it really came to fruition when the goldsmiths in the 1500s started holding people's gold and then giving out kind of chits. People started using that for currency. And then the goldsmiths realized they didn't have to keep all of the gold for all of the chits. And suddenly we had more money than gold. And that, to me, was the slippery slope that we started to go down. And again, every single major religion was against the idea that there should be more money than gold, and also that gold should earn interest. So,
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about defining what money is, because as a medium of exchange, it doesn't really seem to warrant this greed and pursuit. It's a great invention, but I don't think money is just a medium of exchange anymore. I think it's a way that I don't know if we store value or we measure value. And what I found in observation of our society is that we confuse net worth with self worth. And the poor people in our society are literally worthless. They get treated as worthless. And the rich people in our society are definitely full of worth. So, how did we get from just a medium of exchange so we could trade to this thing which really determines our value in the world and governs our lives?
I got my own theory, and I think it started with the notion of private property. It started with the notion that you can own things. I mean, at one point I was very, very taken with libertarian philosophy and the book The Machinery of Freedom by, I guess, Milton Friedman's kid. And I thought it made a whole huge amount of sense until I started saying, well, it's not really working all that well, and it's creating all these wealth disparities. So I went back to the book, and I looked, and I realized that people start with a head start because people start with owning something. And that might seem not much. In fact, the Friedmans said, well, sure, personal property and owning natural resources is a problem, but it's only 6% of the GDP. But that 6% is huge, because the people that start the game owning something have an almost impossible competitive advantage about other people. And I think that's where it all started. But anyway, that's my theory.
Well, let me throw in a couple other things here, because I want to. I think this woke me up in the middle of the night last night, just so you know. And I was trying to say, how do I say this without being in politic here? But money is also power, and power to do what? power over people, right? And so, Karen, you're a woman, I'm a black man, right? And in the history of the world, power over slavery and power over women has been something that is still being pretty, heavily pursued here. And let's not play games here because money is used for those kinds of purposes, right? As we know, at the beginning of the founding of the United States, the net worth of the wealthiest people was tied to their ownership of slaves, right? I mean, the land was okay. Remember, there was tons of land, right? We were stuff, we hadn't even headed west yet, right? And all kind of things. But if you had slaves, you had capital, right? But I was at a concert a couple of years ago, and you know who Peabo Bryson is? He's a wonderful African American singer. He has a beautiful voice. He's one of the most outstanding singers. And he comes on stage and is in his 70s and he says, "Hey, everybody, I got a 4-year-old son." And everybody was like, "Wow, Peabo." So I'm thinking, okay, most women stop having babies in their 40s and you're in your 70s, pal. How does this happen? Now, you're a nice guy. You're Peabo Bryce and all this kind of stuff. But I'm thinking between you and Al Pacino, so money matters in terms of attracting. You can get sexual power out of it, right? So let's be honest that the use of money by people, when we go back as an evil, well, what are they using it for? And I would say it is for power over others in various dimensions. Let me just leave it at that.
I would agree with that, but I also think that the only thing I might take a little bit of issue with you in terms of the history of America, because my jam is really focusing on the Native Americans and the indigenous people who didn't have the concept of private property. There were lands that the tribes, in would develop and trade with others, and there were so in that sense the tribe owned some, but they didn't even own it. They were just inhabiting it. And the concept
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
private property was first introduced in America by the colonists. And my understanding of the colonial times in America was it was all about you can have your own land as opposed to working somebody else's land. And that was the big thing. And of course, from that came the notion, again, maybe in some ways it's the oldest business model in the world of using slaves, enslaving somebody to work the land and increase your wealth, if you will. So, to me, slavery was an outgrowth of private ownership of the land. And
Because, as you know, that was financed by private capital, what we would call private equity today,
yep,
right?
yep,
So there were money from the royal families, there's money from European banking enterprises. In fact, it's so interesting how many of the founding fathers were actually getting capital from either France or from Britain to finance various land purchases and all manner of things. So there always has been this flow of money, flow of capital. And I think that's really the question that I go back to you, Karen, in terms of what's bothering you about today is the global flow of massive amounts of capital that determine our lives in ways we don't even imagine. I mean, the latest story on the sale of TikTok, right? And when you look behind, who are the people who own 15% or 10% of whatever of TikTok? I mean, this is amazing to me that the American government said, "I tell you what, this business over here, we don't like it that the Chinese have some controlling interest in here. You can stay in business, but you got to sell it to some people that we like." And then they went out and selected a bunch of billionaires who don't afford this thing and said, "We're going to give you this deal, and here you go." Right? Well, one of the investors in there is one of the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, I think from Abu Dhabi. I think that's where they're from. Um, and I tell people, do you know what a sovereign wealth fund is? And it's amazing to me how many Americans never heard of that. And I'm like, Do you know
What is it,
somebody is
Gerald?
sitting $750 billion uh, of investable capital that they're trying to figure out what to do with it and how much to put into AI and how much to put into oil and gas developments and how much to put into data centers in the United States and how much to put into automobile companies and how much there's this massive portfolio of capital. And I think the Federal Reserve says it's something like $4 trillion of money sitting in what they call dry powder, which basically is money that's earning less than 1% somewhere in, a money market fund that wants to get out of there and earn 10 or 15 or 20%, right? That pressure right now in the global economy shapes our lives in ways we can't even imagine. That's why OpenAI, Sam Altman, with a straight face now, can say, I think I need 7 trillion. And everybody's like, what is Sam talking about? I mean, is he serious? What? Really?
Still waiting for you to say something I really disagree with.
I'm just reading the newspaper.
But
I'm just staying informed.
I did want to make a couple of comments on that, Gerald. I mean, for one thing, those sovereign funds, particularly in the Middle East, that's fundamentally natural resources. They own oil. I mean, that's where it comes from. So the notion that somebody can own the oil in the ground is, again, one of those fundamental errors or it's not even an error. It's just something with lots of unintended consequences that we are now seeing. But the other thing I wanted to point out is, you're absolutely right about this massive capital and the way it's just shaping and controlling and moving things. But why is there so much capital? I mean, there's only 34,000 tons or maybe more now of gold. Okay. And gold is at 5,000 an ounce. So, maybe there's, a few trillion, maybe a few tens of trillions of dollars in gold, which theoretically is the basis for money and all capital. But we have so leveraged the world, and the way we've leveraged it is it's essentially a call on the future production and the future, basically, resources of the earth that gets turned into something. And I don't know, these days there's probably about a quadrillion, and that's a number I never thought I would see with a dollar sign attached to it. I mean, I thought quadrillion, that's kind of like astronomical. That's how distances to the nearest star.
We would be dead if we started counting from 1 to get to that number. We'd all,
Yeah,
we'd all be dead. Yeah.
but point is the leverage in the world is astonishing. I mean, it's 99, probably 99 point something percent, and that's not sustainable. I don't think.
And Pete, obviously I agree. I think we're all in really agreement here. It's turned so many of our investments that people think of as value into casinos. I mean, it's which this leverage creates these ripples from little movements. And I've come to the realization that something like the stock market, which is supposed to be a reflection of the value of the companies, that you're investing in, it's not at all. I mean, we've really broken the connection between the value of what we're investing in now with all of this money just pouring into it, because people are just chasing returns, and the returns are ephemeral. If you think it's going to return, it's a giant Ponzi scheme.
Yes,
It's like we're
I agree,
living in
yeah.
a giant Ponzi scheme, and we all know that eventually the Ponzi
Yeah.
schemes are going to go bust.
and so
The giant game of what we call greater fool theory, right? And that was one of my most valuable lessons when I was at University of Chicago. Was we had a class where a professor came in and explained the greater fool theory to us, and I was like, "Wow, man, this is amazing!" Right? So he says it's very simple: is that you have an asset and you think it's worth X, right? And you want to sell it to somebody, right, for a higher return. He says, only thing you need is a bigger fool than you who thinks it's worth more than what you think it is. Right.
And
And you
thank
just keep,
goodness there's 8 billion people, right? So you're going to
yeah,
find a
you just
fool.
keep turning the thing over. Right. And I remember seeing a painting some years ago where a guy had just sold a boat. Right. And the picture had two people, the guy who was buying the boat, who was in total euphoria. Right. And the guy who was selling the boat, who was like, oh my God, let me get out here with this guy's money. Right. So I think it's that. And I think it's the classic, buy low, sell high, you know,
Yeah.
that's the,
On the other hand, I do think there are things. In fact, this is where I'm putting my money is into real things. I'm putting it into land, and I may agree with you that maybe people shouldn't be able to own a piece of land, but since that's the case, I've got a piece of land. And the other thing, I have a friend who's in the same business as me, and actuary, and we were talking about the apocalypse, and it's all going to crash. And he said, if you really believe that the stock market and everything's going to crash, buy Exxon, because Exxon has plants, equipment, and they have the wherewithal to provide energy to people, and people are going to need energy. And so I think there's just to add a little more granularity to the picture you paint there, Gerald, is I do think there is real stuff that is there, but you're right. There's a lot of stuff that is just
well, let me question a couple of things there, because I've come of the opinion, and maybe this is from growing older, that the most valuable thing I can have is relationships, right? It's not an asset of any kind. The most valuable thing I can have is my back is killing me, and a friend comes over with some Aleve and some kind of cannabis something to put on my back, and all of a sudden I can get up and walk around, right? In terms of land ownership, I've learned something dangerous about that. The land is yours as long as you pay the property taxes. As soon as you don't, you're out, right? So ultimately, the state really owns all land. You only own it to the extent that you pay the taxes. Nobody owns any
yeah.
land, actually. Yeah. There was a piece that just came out last week about the largest owners of land in the United States. And I think one of them is the owner of the Los Angeles Lakers or something like that. And they listed the top 3 or 4 in the New York Times. Um, and some of them own like the size of half of New Jersey or something. It's like, wow, man, what are you going to do with all that? And maybe it's the same theory that they feel that if they own, something like that, it's going to always appreciate in value because you can't make more of it, right? I mean, the president of Ukraine just said last week that this is about land.
So
So I
like,
hear you loud and clear.
can I ask you a question? Because
Yeah.
I hear you very, very loud and clear about the
Hmm.
property taxes, but it's theoretically I'm getting something for my property taxes, the school system, and maybe more generally protection against whatever. But my question to you is, what do you think about taxes? Because taxes that's a big chunk of where the money goes.
Well, I learned something interesting about taxes reading on the Fortunes of the Founders, that the first thing that the U.S. Senate, when it was formed, passed was a law in which all those bonds they had given to the soldiers because they didn't have any money for fighting in the Revolutionary War would be repaid at 100% on the dollar, right? Now, it just so happens that a lot of the soldiers who were poor as palm water, who got these, pieces of paper, these bonds and stuff, had sold them for a nickel or something because they needed food and land and water. So they just gave all this stuff away, right? So basically, a bunch of wealthy people bought all these things, right? And so as soon as the Senate came into place and they could pass legislation, they immediately did that, right? Now, so the question became, where are they going to get the money from to pay that? Well, that's when taxes came in. But taxes to me are about is two things. One is making sure the army gets paid. Because if you don't pay them, they got guns, right?
Right.
That was the problem. George Washington had to resolve that, right? So
Well,
you gotta have money for that.
reading, the history of the fiat currencies, it's the whole point of taxes was to create a currency and make people use it.
But the people who were using it were people who fought in the army.
Yeah, you needed the money to pay the armies, and that before the fiat currencies, that people just use credit. Some of the oldest written works are ledgers, and people got along, trading without a use of currency because they just, accounting. You owe me this, you owe me that, and let's figure it all out. And so people were able to trade and exchange without currencies.
I got a question for both of you then. I mean, do you think society can run without leverage, without taxation? Because, right. So what do we do?
I think we have to avoid two things: scandal and theft, right? You got to avoid that. It's like when something is spinning, you don't want it to spin out of control. The centrifugal forces to tear the damn thing apart, right? So you got to have some way of putting your finger on the thing and keeping it from spinning out of control, which is to me what the Federal Reserve Bank does. But that's also worries me about digital currencies. I'm really afraid of Bitcoin and all the rest of the stuff because I don't know how you put your finger on that to slow that down. But I don't know if you guys watched the Silicon Valley Bank collapse a couple of years ago. What happened there? Basically, the person in the company who was supposed to be watching the overall portfolio balance of debt was fired, and they never replaced the person whose job it was to manage the risk profile of the bank itself. So it spun out of control. Well, Wall Street got the sense that, hey, wait a minute, I don't think these guys can cover their bets here. Bank starts collapsing overnight. The Federal Reserve had to come in very quickly because 50% of all Silicon Valley startups had an account in that bank.
The story's been repeated again and again and again, and is often the generative event of financial crises. I mean, I can remember watching AIG,
Yes,
and that was astonished. As an actuary, I was really my mind was blown by that because this is one of the biggest. I think it was the biggest insurance company in the world at the
right.
time, and I was in France at the time reading the Herald Tribune, and
Hmm.
I couldn't believe what I was reading. That here was this company that was going to require like $80 billion
Rescue, yeah,
overnight, or it's going to go
right.
out of
No.
I'm going to have to declare bankruptcy. How did that happen? You know,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
it was the leverage all coming due at the same time, I guess.
Well, it was all these special bets that people were making,
And no one
which are basically spreadsheets. That's all they were.
no one really understood what they were doing. I mean, my experience of life in the corporate world especially is that, you know, people don't really know know what's going
The
on
average
or what
person
they're
doesn't
doing.
for sure. Yeah.
What about the people that are paid to know, like the treasurers and the controllers and the actuaries and I mean, shouldn't they be on the job?
All it takes is a layoff. Do you know what I mean? That's and again, they want to save money. Um, and and one of the things, you mentioned about with AIG and the banks during the 2008 crisis is what really, really drove me crazy is that the Treasury, Bernanke made the decision to shore up the banks when they could have just as easily bought the mortgages. But somehow buying the mortgages from the individual families was not, morally justified, but giving the money to the banks was. And I can't help but feel that, that there's something else tied up with money that's a very moral issue for us. And what we do with it. And in this world of all this leverage and the cash flows, that we kind of need to figure out why we're okay with private equity buying a hospital and slashing the number of doctors, but we're not okay with giving that money to the poor patients. So that's kind of what prompted some of this, and like, what is money? And it seems to be that money is, talking with you too, that seems to be a little bit out of control now. And, you know, if it's out of control, how do we get back to a place, you know, where there's more equity? David Graeber, before he died, suggested that we have massive debt forgiveness kind of thing. Everybody brings in their debts, so their debts get forgiven in the way they used to do back in ancient times. But what do you think about that? I mean, what do you think about the kind of ethics that's tied up subconsciously in money?
Well, I mean, I just don't think things scale as well as people think. So, what I'm a big believer in Piketty. In capitalism is inherently, because everybody's, people, property owner, people with personal property have a head start. It's inherently is going to lead to an unstable situation where there are too few haves and too many have-nots, and then things collapse and they crumble. But how does the world survive? It builds back from the local. I've become hyper local in my view. It starts with my family and my close friends, and then it expands out to the community, and I actually think things can work on a community, city, maybe even a county level, where there's only one or two degrees of separation. If you don't know the person making the decisions, you know somebody who knows the person who's making the decisions. And so I think what you're going to see in terms of money is you're going to see complementary currencies. You see these community-based credits. Berkeley has one. I think there was a couple in the Berkshires. There are these Berkshires, and they're all over the place. And I think that's the way we're going to survive. So I'm long term, I'm not pessimistic. I'm actually optimistic. But I think there's going to be a breakdown and then a build back up from the ground. But that's my view.
I want to go to this question on morality that you raised, Karen, because and maybe this is where my scenario narrative stuff comes in, which is that, scenarios is nothing but telling a story about the future, right? And you can have various, versions of those, and they can be useful if you have various ones to help you think more clearly or learn, ask questions. You're in dialogue with these possible futures that you're creating. It's a wonderful tool, right? But what I've learned from that is the narrative, the story that you're telling. And it's interesting to me that one story that the American people seem to be ready to believe is blaming the victim.
Yeah.
The reason this person was shot in Minnesota is because they were interfering with, legitimate police activity, and this person is a leftist radical fool. Right. So this is where, to me, the moral issue comes in. It's how are we manufacturing stories of beliefs about groups of people? And of course, the elite always want to manufacture a story about themselves that says, I went to Stanford and my mother and father are Stanford professors, law professors, in fact. And I was a math whiz. Okay. So I can form a Bitcoin company called FTX, and you can give me $500 million to fund it, and you don't even get a seat on the board for that because I am Sam Bankman-Fried, right? That's his story. And they bought it, right? So to me, it's this narrative about people.
Doesn't it
And
come
that's
back
where
to
we get
human
the slippery
nature?
slope of morality is what story do you want to believe?
But I mean, you go back to the Bible, the 10 Commandments. I mean, it's about human nature that's at the root of all this, isn't it?
But
Pride,
it's about why do
pride.
people want to believe certain people and make other people victims, right? The people issue is what I'm getting at,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
I mean,
agree.
remember in this country until what, the 20s or 30s, women couldn't even open a bank account because your period every month made you emotionally unstable. That was the
Gerald,
narrative, right?
you don't have to tell me because I remember some of those.
There you
But
go.
I have this belief about human nature and how it kind of plays out is that in as much as we have created a very competitive society in capitalism, we do need to cooperate. I think, societies are cooperative and we operate on a tit for tat basis. But there's certain bad behaviors that tend to permeate through societies. And, I call them slackers. Right? You get, your homework project, right? And you get your team of 5 and one person slacks off. The 4 people do the work and he gets an A, and then the second project is due and now there's only 3 people doing the work. Because it's like, right? Because it's bad behavior that just permeates through society. But we also have it on the other end as the exploiters. People are stealing your time, people are stealing your money. And and I think this is where regulation needs to come in, on both ends. Okay, well, we're going to get together and we're going to, have this collaborative group of people. And then someone gets the bright idea. Well, I'm going to milk this group of people for money. I'm not going to just contribute. I'm going to make them pay for my contribution. And then someone else says, well, if you're paying him for his contribution, you got to pay me for a contribution. And now nobody will contribute unless they get paid. So I see that as the fundamental human nature problem. And, in a very, very simplified, version, the way communism didn't work is you just created a group of slackers. And what's going on now with capitalism is you just created a group of exploiters. So, so I guess, my question is what do we need to do to get back to a more cooperative society, especially in capitalism, which is built on, competition? Or should we try? Or-
Well, no, I think what you're pointing out is there's this cycle in human conditions, right? That to me, that's a pendulum that's swinging back and forth. I mean, if you read history, there always have been. I mean, I've just been reading this book on Leonardo da Vinci, right? And for a while, the part of Italy that he was in was very diverse, and there were different kinds of people, and there was a very richness there and stuff. And so these things last for a period of time, but as they say, the center cannot hold, right? Eventually, the extremes start politically arguing and they tear the thing apart, right? And so I think you only have just periods of time where, and I think this was going on in this country. We've had this period of time where there was something called being an American and we had a shared set of values and kind of thing. And now the extremes are just pulling us apart, right? So we're just in that cycle. And I don't think the way the human brain works, particularly around things like hoarding and sexual dominance and those kinds of things, control of beauty, control of standards, control of the cultural norms, all that kind of stuff, basically power. You're always going to have some person that's born who is self-centered, driven person who thinks that it ought to be mine and you always work for me. That person always shows up.
Yeah. You know, to me, one of the more interesting history lessons I had is how women got the vote. Langley, Washington gave women the vote, and they kicked all the men that were on the city council out, elected an all women city council, cleaned up all the corruption, and it's been a very well run city ever since, 100 and something years ago. Well, different cities saw that and they picked it up, and cities and counties here and there. And eventually, there were so many counties in the state of Wyoming that had given the women the vote that the state of Wyoming was the first state to give the women the vote. And eventually, enough states did it, so it was inevitable. And I think that's how the world gets repaired.
It's bottom up, innovation, bottom up. Yeah. Yeah. Right, right, right. And maybe we're seeing a few signals of that when you were talking about localism. And I know there's this whole movement around cutting back on consumption that you need all this stuff. And I think you're right there. Maybe what is the power dynamic that's going to play in that? That's the question I think we should watch.
I mean, I think the environment is a perfect example. You know, start with these top-down global climate change conferences, they never work, but if you look at on the ground and you see communities taking care of their local environment, making sure the water is clean, that make sure that, you know, that you don't do something stupid and develop in a certain, and then eventually the world cleans up.
I mean, for the years I lived out near the ocean in San Francisco, and 2 times a year, people would come out and they just get all the trash, trash bags, and then just clean all that up. It clean things up, right? So, I think you're right. It probably is the environmental movement because this is where people have a upfront and personal connection with reality, right? Like, I can't breathe.
Or
I'm
I can't
choking on the
drink my
water,
water. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
you know,
And that gets back to your localism point too. And I spent a large part of my career in organizational change. And I think if you look at a lot of the methodologies, I always assume this top-down change and top-down change doesn't really work. It's got to be bottom up because the people on the bottom are not going to march to the tune of somebody on the top telling them what to do. That's just human nature that we resist being changed.
One more thing about women, though, about women.
Sure.
I think it's really interesting to me that the whole Jeff Bezos situation, it's amazing to me. So you married to this wonderful woman who's helped you become fabulously wealthy. And you go to Hollywood and start making movies and you see this hot little thing and you dump your wife. Now, you have to give her a lot of freaking money to do that. So this hot little thing costs you billions of freaking dollars. And then you have a wedding in France and you invite all these people to see you. So this whole money sexual dynamic thing to me, it's interesting. And I hate to tell you this, but sometimes our conversations are too nice. We're not calling it, I mean, that was money, sexual power being displayed for everybody to see. So, I hate to just be blunt about it, but if we're going to talk about money, we better stop being nice about it because people will kill you over it. They will blow your brains out over it.
or
That's what's going on in
or
Ukraine right now.
starve you, cut off all of your ability to sustain yourself. So,
Yeah, I mean, money is not a plaything when we talk about the pursuit of it. And the people who have it really want to exercise serious power. I mean, Donald Trump goes to the head of NVIDIA and says, I tell you what, pal, if you want to sell to the Chinese, you got to give me and the federal government 10%. Take it or leave it, pal. What is that? That's an exercise of pure power. So we better keep our eyes on this because this is not, I mean, the questions we're asking here is not a game. It is not a game.
It's
It's not
evil.
a game.
I
It's not a
think a
game.
lot of, I mean, you make a good point, which is what prompted this discussion, is these people who have exorbitant amounts of money don't have enough and they need more and they need domination. Like, why is Elon Musk asking for $1 trillion pay package?
And what would you do with that? Right? So when they hear that, what happens to them? Do they go mad? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
So going kind of full circle, we talked about money as being a medium of exchange and then a store of value. But I think now maybe what money has become is power and the ability to dominate others.
my ex-wife used to say that money is fire, and she was absolutely right. I think money is fire. It can keep you warm at night. It can cook your food. It can keep the beasts away, but it can also burn your house down and kill you. And that's what we've got. And fire was one of those other brilliant human inventions that we've made just a little too clever and a little too
Hmm.
destructive. So
Right. So, Karen, the question I have for you is when you go back to the morality of it, maybe the question for all of us is, could we see the emergence of some new modern moral standards that can influence this? Because, we've had these spiritual evolutions, right? Last year I spent 3 weeks in Greece. I was in a place, I think it was Naxos, and there was an incomplete temple to Apollo there. All they had done is built the frame. And I thought, this is amazing, because here these people were in the midst of building a temple, and all of a sudden they split. Like, boom, man, we're out of here. Like, wow, how did this happen, right? And it turns out it was the Muslims and the Christians that came over and said, "Hey, man, you need to stop believing all that stuff. There's the sun god and all that kind of stuff. It's these people over here. This is how you should, reorganize your whole spiritual existence, right?" And then off they run into something else, right? I mean, are we at one of these inflection points around that? I don't know, because it's normally some, you know, person who embodies this in some kind of way, or some story we create, whatever. But I do think that there may be a need for some kind of emergent new way of understanding morality around these disparities in wealth and all the stuff that you've been concerned about.
I
I
think go ahead.
sorry, I often think, it's just changing our paradigm about these things. And if we look at billionaires and just think, okay, these are hoarders, there's something mentally not right with them. And so instead of this massive amounts of wealth becoming a badge of honor that I deserve this, I'm a worthy person, that we look at it and say, no, no, you're a hoarder. You are inadequate. Something inside you is missing and inadequate, and you need to fill it with money. And if we create that paradigm that we look at billionaires and go, ooh, maybe you should seek help, just start thinking about people in that respect.
Well, I think that's right, but I also wanted to say to Gerald, I think what you're actually painting a pretty optimistic view of human nature and our ability to evolve. And I think the jury is out as to whether or not humans are capable of evolving as a species, but we need to. And in a sense, we may even be at that evolutionary choke point where we really got to get our spiritual and moral act together, or we're not going to be around.
Well, but these transitions are violent, because you have to overturn the old order, and the old order doesn't go away willingly. And so, to bring in a new way of thinking, a new set of values, every time this occurs, the people who have the old set, unfortunately, they don't want to disappear, and they don't want to go down easy. So that's what concerns me, is there's some kind of violence that we need to, unfortunately, go through, uh, to get to that. Do we need to burn down? I mean, when I look at, like, September 11th, right, when the Twin Towers came down, that image, right, to me, you know, that was a direct attack on American capitalism and global dominance, right? And we responded with an awful lot of violence. We still are responding to it with an awful lot of violence, right? But we know there's something wrong with it. We know there's something wrong with a very, very small group of people who happen to control a massive amount of capital, determine how people live their lives. We know there's something wrong with that. We don't know how to stop it, but we know there's something wrong with it.
Okay. Well, we've been talking for an hour. This has been a good conversation. I hope to end a little bit on an up note. I mean, Gerald, you make a good point. Um, is there violence? I think there's definitely a new world order happening or a change. I don't know if we're gonna break out of the cycles, that we've been living. It's been like a to me, it seems like history is like a pendulum swinging back and forth. Are we ever gonna reach a point of morality where we'll let everybody have enough? I hope so. But, Pete, you mentioned localism, and maybe that's the answer.
Yeah. Well, I'm betting against the apocalypse. Even though I've made my money over the years warning of people about things that almost never happen. But and who knows exactly what's going to happen, but I do think we're going to survive, and I do think we're going to come out of this okay. It's going to be rough.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. I'm not in the apocalyptic group as well, but I am in the, well, we may have a rough transition here, but I do think we will survive. I'm not concerned about that.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
It seems like money, it's more than just this thing we spend. It really is influencing how we live our lives and morality and everything. And I learned a lot from the discussion. So thank you.
All right. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
All right.
Thank
Great.
you.
Bye now.